The tape machine stopped abruptly. The sudden silence in Pachyderm Studio felt like violence. Steve Albini stood at the mixing board with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Kurt Cobain sat on the floor in the corner of the control room, guitar across his lap, staring at nothing. February 1993, Minnesota, 20 degrees below zero outside, and the temperature inside the studio was dropping fast. Albini broke the silence with 3 words that would change everything. This wasn't how recording In Utero was supposed to go. Nirvana had chosen Steve Albini specifically because he was the opposite of everything. Nevermind had been Bob Rock, who'd produced Nevermind, had polished their sound until it gleamed, had layered guitars until they were massive, had processed Kurt's voice until it cut through radio static like a knife. The result had sold 20 million copies and made Nirvana the biggest band in the world. And Kurt Cobain hated almost everything about it. So for the follow-up, Kurt wanted raw, wanted real, wanted the sound of a band, in a room playing together without tricks or processing or studio magic. He wanted Steve Albini, the underground legend who'd recorded the Pixies and Big Black, the man who famously refused to take producer credits because he considered himself an engineer, not a creative collaborator, the purist who believed in capturing performances exactly as they happened, warts and all, the only person in the music industry who seemed to share Kurt's contempt for corporate rock production. Albini had accepted the job with conditions. He would record Nirvana his way, no interference from the label, no pressure to make radio-friendly sounds, no compromise on his recording philosophy. Kurt had agreed immediately. Finally, someone who understood, someone who wouldn't try to turn Nirvana into something they weren't, someone who would let them make the album they actually wanted to make instead of the album that would sell the most copies. But 2 weeks into the sessions at Pachyderm Studio, buried in the frozen Minnesota wilderness, things were not going according to plan. The problem was fundamental. Steve Albini's recording philosophy was simple. Set up microphones. Capture the band playing live. Don't fix anything in post-production. If a take wasn't perfect, play it again. No overdubs. No studio trickery. Just honest documentation of honest performance. This approach had worked brilliantly for countless underground bands. But Nirvana, despite their punk rock roots and anti-commercial posturing, had spent the past 1.5 years being the biggest band in the world. They'd gotten used to certain luxuries, certain possibilities, certain ways of working that Albini considered corruption. Kurt had been struggling from day one. His vision for In Utero was clear in his head but difficult to execute in Albini's rigid framework. He wanted songs that were simultaneously raw and complex, aggressive but nuanced. He wanted to reject commercial polish without rejecting craft. But every time he suggested an overdub or wanted to layer guitars or asked about processing his vocals differently, Albini shut him down. That's not how we work. That's not honest recording. That's studio bullshit. The tension had been building for days. Small disagreements, philosophical differences that seemed minor but pointed to a fundamental incompatibility. Kurt wanted collaboration. Wanted someone to help him realize the sounds in his head. But Albini didn't collaborate. Albini documented. He saw his role as capturing what the band did, not shaping what they did. And the gap between what Kurt wanted and what Albini was willing to do was growing wider with every session. Things came to a head during the recording of Heart-Shaped Box. Kurt had played the basic track. Guitar, bass, drums, rough vocal. It sounded good, raw and powerful, in the way Albini's recordings always sounded. But Kurt heard more. He wanted to add another guitar part, wanted to thicken the chorus, wanted to create layers that would make the song more dynamic, more interesting, more what he heard in his head when he'd written it. Albini said no. Not a philosophical no. Not a let's discuss this no. Just no. That's not how we're doing this record. Kurt tried to explain his vision, tried to make Albini understand what he was hearing. But Albini was unmovable. If Kurt wanted overdubs and layers and studio construction, he should have hired Bob Rock again. Albini was here to record a band, not build a studio creation. Either they did it his way, or they didn't do it at all. Kurt had walked out of the control room, sat on the floor in the corner, and that's where things stood when Albini stopped the tape machine, and the silence became unbearable. Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic sat in the live room, able to see into the control room through the glass, but unable to hear what was being said. They could see the tension in both men's postures, could see this wasn't just a disagreement about one song. This was something bigger, something that threatened to derail the entire album. Albini looked at Kurt, sitting on the floor, and made his position clear. He'd been hired to record Nirvana the way he recorded bands. If that wasn't what Kurt wanted, if Kurt wanted to make another corporate rock record, with tricks and overdubs and processing, then Albini was the wrong person for the job. He'd pack up his equipment and leave. No hard feelings. But he wasn't compromising his principles. Not for Nirvana. Not for anyone. The threat hung in the air. Albini genuinely didn't care if he walked away from the biggest band in the world. His reputation in the underground was built on integrity, not commercial success. He'd rather have no credit on a Nirvana album than compromise his recording philosophy. And everyone in that studio knew he meant it, knew he would actually walk out and leave them with 2 weeks of recordings that didn't match Kurt's vision and no producer to finish the album. Kurt stayed on the floor, processing. This was the moment every artist faces when their ideals meet reality. When the thing you thought you wanted turns out to be complicated in ways you didn't anticipate. Kurt had chosen Albini specifically to reject the commercial slickness of Nevermind. To make a punk rock statement about artistic purity over commercial accessibility. But now, faced with the reality of Albini's uncompromising approach, Kurt was discovering that pure punk rock philosophy didn't leave room for the kind of artistic ambition he actually had. The silence stretched. Minutes passed. Dave and Chris exchanged worried glances through the control room glass. This could end the session, could end the album, could create a situation where Nirvana had no album to release and had alienated one of the most respected figures in underground music. The label would be furious. The fans would be disappointed, and Kurt would have to explain how his attempt to make an uncompromising punk rock album had resulted in no album at all. Then Kurt stood up, walked to where Albini was standing at the mixing board, and said something that nobody expected, something that showed a level of self-awareness and artistic maturity that surprised everyone present. He said he'd been wrong, not wrong to want overdubs or layers or complexity, but wrong to think that this approach and Albini's approach could coexist. Wrong to think he could have punk rock purity and studio sophistication at the same time. Wrong to think Albini would or should compromise. But Kurt didn't stop there. He kept talking, and what he said next would become legendary in music production circles. He told Albini that maybe the problem wasn't Albini's approach. Maybe the problem was Kurt's assumption that he needed overdubs and layers and studio tricks to make the songs work. Maybe the real punk rock move was to trust the raw performances, to let the songs exist as they were played, rather than building them into something else in the studio. Maybe the discomfort Kurt was feeling wasn't a sign that Albini was wrong. Maybe it was a sign that Kurt was still too attached to commercial recording methods. It was a complete reversal, a surrender that was actually a breakthrough. Kurt wasn't arguing that Albini should change. He was arguing that he himself should change, should challenge his own assumptions about what a Nirvana album needed to sound like, should trust that simplicity and rawness could be enough, should embrace the discomfort instead of fighting it. Albini's expression didn't change. He wasn't the type to get emotional or celebratory, but he nodded, said they could continue, said if Kurt was willing to work within the constraints of honest recording, they could make something special, something that would stand as a rejection of everything corporate rock had become, something real, and they did. The rest of the Utero sessions proceeded under Albini's rules. No overdubs except where absolutely essential, no studio processing, no polishing rough edges. Kurt threw himself into the approach, stopped trying to build songs in the studio and focused on performing them as powerfully as possible in the moment. Stopped thinking about how songs would sound on the radio and started thinking about how they represented what Nirvana actually was. The album that resulted was exactly what Kurt had claimed to want when he hired Albini. Raw, aggressive, uncompromising. A complete rejection of the polished accessibility that had made Nevermind a commercial juggernaut. Songs like Scentless Apprentice sounded like they were recorded in a garage. Radio-friendly unit shifter was deliberately abrasive. Even the more melodic tracks like Dumb and All Apologies had a stripped-down quality that made them feel vulnerable rather than crafted. When Geffen Records first heard the finished In Utero recordings, they panicked. This didn't sound like a follow-up to Nevermind. This sounded like Nirvana actively trying to alienate their audience. The label demanded remixes, wanted to bring in a different producer to make the album more radio-friendly, wanted to smooth out the rough edges that made it sound so confrontational. But Kurt refused. He'd made his decision in that Minnesota studio. He'd committed to Albini's approach, and he was going to see it through. The standoff with Geffen would become its own legendary battle. But it started in that Pachyderm Studio control room. Started with Steve Albini's threat to walk away and Kurt Cobain's decision to change his own approach, rather than asking Albini to change his. That moment of surrender, of accepting constraints rather than fighting them, shaped everything that came after. In Utero was released in September 1993, exactly as Albini had recorded it, with only minor remixing of 2 songs for radio release. It debuted at #1, despite sounding nothing like what mainstream audiences expected from Nirvana. Critics praised its raw honesty. Underground fans celebrated Kurt's refusal to make Nevermind Part 2. And the album's commercial success proved that audiences were willing to follow artists into uncomfortable territory if the art felt genuine. But the real victory wasn't commercial. It was artistic. Kurt had wanted to make a punk rock statement, had wanted to reject corporate slickness and studio manipulation, and by accepting Albini's threat, by choosing to work within severe constraints rather than fighting them, he'd actually achieved what he set out to do. He'd made an album that felt honest, that sounded like a band in a room playing together, that rejected all the tricks and processing that had made Nevermind palatable to mainstream audiences. Years later, after Kurt's death, Albini would talk about the In Utero sessions in interviews. He'd describe that moment of confrontation, Kurt on the floor, the threat to walk away, and Kurt's surprising response. Albini said he'd expected Kurt to fire him, expected the young rock star to throw a tantrum and demand his way. But instead, Kurt had shown maturity and self-awareness that impressed. Even the notoriously hard-to-impress Albini had been willing to question his own assumptions, had been brave enough to embrace discomfort. Dave Grohl remembered that Minnesota session differently. He remembered the tension, the fear that the album would fall apart, but he also remembered the shift that happened after Kurt's conversation with Albini. The way Kurt stopped fighting the process and started trusting it. The way the performances got better. When Kurt stopped trying to fix everything in post-production and focused on playing everything right in the moment. The way the album started to feel cohesive once everyone accepted the constraints they were working within. Chris Novoselic saw it as quintessentially Kurt, always questioning, always willing to challenge his own positions, always more interested in being right than in being consistent. Kurt had hired Albini for punk rock purity, had gotten punk rock purity, had initially resisted it, and then had embraced it completely once he understood what it actually meant. That ability to change course, to admit being wrong, to accept uncomfortable truths, that was what made Kurt more than just another rock star. The In Utero sessions at Pachyderm Studio lasted 2 weeks total. The album was recorded quickly, efficiently, without the lengthy production process that characterized most major label releases. Albini's approach didn't allow for endless tinkering. You played it, he recorded it. If it was good, you moved on. If it wasn't good, you played it again. Simple, direct, honest. And by the end of those 2 weeks, Nirvana had created something that sounded completely different from anything else on commercial radio. The album's rawness was its strength. Songs sounded dangerous, unpredictable, like they might fall apart at any moment, but somehow held together. Through sheer force of performance, Kurt's vocals were mixed lower than on Nevermind, buried in the instruments, forcing listeners to lean in to hear the lyrics. The guitars were harsh and abrasive, without the stadium rock power of Bob Rock's production. The drums sounded like drums in a room rather than drums, processed to sound larger than life. Everything about In Utero rejected the conventions of major label rock production in 1993, and it worked. Not despite its rawness, but because of it. The album felt authentic in a way that mainstream rock rarely felt. Felt like it came from real people dealing with real issues, rather than from a corporate boardroom trying to calculate what would sell. Felt dangerous and unpredictable and genuinely subversive, all because Kurt Cobain had been willing to accept Steve Albini's threat and change his own approach rather than compromising the album's integrity. That moment in the Pachyderm control room became a dividing line in Kurt's career. Before that moment, he'd been struggling with the gap between his punk rock ideals and his major label reality. After that moment, he'd found a way to bridge that gap, to use major label resources to make genuinely uncompromising music, to prove that commercial success and artistic integrity didn't have to be mutually exclusive if you were willing to fight hard enough and accept the consequences. The consequences weren't small. In Utero sold well, but not nearly as well as Nevermind. Radio play was limited. MTV was uncomfortable with songs like Rape Me. Some fans who'd loved Nevermind found In Utero too abrasive and turned away. But other fans, particularly those who'd been following Nirvana since the underground days, celebrated the album as a return to form, as proof that success hadn't completely corrupted the band, as evidence that Kurt Cobain still cared more about making good music than making popular music. The threat Steve Albini made in that Minnesota studio was real. He would have walked away, would have left Nirvana with an unfinished album and a production nightmare. But Kurt's response turned potential disaster into triumph, turned confrontation into collaboration, turned a threat into an opportunity to make the most honest album of Nirvana's career. And in doing so, Kurt created a template for how artists could work with uncompromising producers, not by fighting them, not by demanding they compromise, but by accepting their constraints and finding creativity within those boundaries. That's what happened in Pachyderm Studio in February 1993. That's how a threat from one of music's most uncompromising producers became the foundation of one of rock's most uncompromising albums. That's how Kurt Cobain's willingness to change his own approach, rather than asking others to change theirs, resulted in a rock legend, not through confrontation, not through compromise, but through acceptance, through the courage to embrace constraints, through the wisdom to know when surrendering is actually winning.